So the analytical and political force of queerness, I think, is its ability to undo the seeming naturalisation of these identity categories, and therefore to radically undermine the idea that human nature can be separated reliably on account of sexual, what we now believe as these opposing or managed sexual orientations, whether we're gay or straight. The important questions then about people, their morality, their spirituality, their entitlements to citizenship, their ability to care for children, they could never be judged according to whether we're sexually interested and intimate with people of the so-called opposite or the same sex. So I want to use the term queer to avoid the noisy fray around the issue of homophobia, and also to avoid that kind of inherited idea of sexual organisation around homo-heterosexuality. And also to try and refuse the often cited impossibility of Caribbean sexuality as being anything other than straight. That's really been the assumption that so many of the papers today have tried to work against. The way I'm going to do this is a bit risky, but anyway, I'm going to have a go and see if it works, and I'm sure you'll all tell me if it doesn't. I'm going to work from an opposing perspective and argue, perhaps controversially, that in many ways the two concepts of queerness and Caribbeanness have significant areas of complementarity and overlap. In fact, the Caribbean is already queer. Remembering again that queer identities are those that operate against and expose the normalising ideologies of identity, whether nationality, race, class, gender or sexuality. The Caribbean becomes a queer place. As Derek Walcott Shabine says in his brilliantly early work, The Schooner Flight, I had no nation now but the imagination. The Caribbean is an invented place, remade by the ragged and ruptured history of colonialism and the plantation economy. The differently marked arrivals of Africans, Indians, Chinese, Irish, Syrians, etc., who were brought to the region as part of forced, misled, opportunist migration, and the decimation of the majority of the indwelling populations by disease or violence, meant that in the Caribbean, in a way that's perhaps more pronounced and extreme than anywhere else, the relationship between people and place was discontinuous, layered, and precarious. Yet one of the important consequences of that is that the nation is imagination or design. For Caribbean subjects, particularly those located in the Caribbean, all these efforts to make a people that, again, Kellyanne was talking about, are inventions that must consciously style rather than assume belonging. The necessity of invention can be seen aphoristically in all those national mottos, all of we as one, out of many one people, one nation, one people, one destiny. If that was already the case, why would we need to say it, you know? So even the virtual community, westindia.com, has the banner, all are we as one family. So my point then is that the Caribbean is a place without clear or single origin, without guaranteed lineage, and therefore without the inherited deterministic signatures of being, is already a queer place. It's a place where identity is unmasked as performance, as what can be crafted, invented, and styled, rather than what is discovered and known, however much that knowledge is always already a myth. As Shani Mutu suggestively describes when giving an account of her ancestral story of Indian Trinidadians who changed their names to trade caste and maybe even religion, she says, why not? In a new land they may as well become whatsoever and whosoever they fancied. And I like the idea that she says that they fancied. The way in which Caribbeanness, and in other words desire, is kind of circulated within the nation in extraordinary and surprising ways. The way in which Caribbeanness and queerness connect, or at least align, can be seen in echoes of both as the vanishing point for the known, the guaranteed, the deterministic, the confidently outlined. So we have Benitez Rojo saying, Caribbeanness will always remain beyond the horizon, and then Jose Muno talking about queerness. Queerness is always on the horizon. Indeed, for queerness to have any value whatsoever, it must be considered visible only on the horizon. Both the Caribbean and the concept of the queer mark a place where these disappearing acts of being and the inventions of belonging are acknowledged. My argument for the Caribbean as an always already queer space is an argument to reverse and alter the angle at which rights and representations can meet. Rather than queering the Caribbean, and I've seen that's become so much a refrain. I noticed at CSA the last couple of times there's been loads and loads of queering the Caribbean. And I think the problem with that is calling upon already established representational frames or interpretive gestures to deliver rights to the Caribbean. And that's a project that I would see as perhaps having an important role within gay liberation politics, but it's not to queer. Queering is the wrong term, I think. So I want to argue then that we reverse this and that we think about the Caribbean queer. That we consider what might be possible. Indeed, my argument is that it's already here, it's already possible, if we just shift the meeting point between knowledge, experience, and the definition of lives. In her recent study, Feeling Backwards, Heather Love, I'm so envious of that name, argues that queer studies needs to take account of loss, trauma, and difficulty, elements that have been downplayed or disavowed within the dominant narrative. She says, the origin story of gay liberation describes how on one particular night an underground bar turned into the front line of a struggle for freedom and civil rights. Early work in lesbian and gay studies was marked by the legacy of Stonewall and by the sudden turn of this movement of reverse discourse. The emergent field's powerful utopianism, affirmation of gay identity and hope for the future resonated with the seemingly magical power of this new movement to translate shame into pride, secrecy into visibility, social exclusion into outsider glamour. In some ways, I could call my critical manoeuvre feeling sideways. What I want to do is to account for the rather different emphasis on place, where Love's looking at history, I want to look at geography, but also to suggest a hoped-for departure from or a striking out against the centrality of that same model of non-heteronormative identity and realization, what we often call the coming out story. Of course, there are, and we should acknowledge, important publications that confirm the need to name gay and lesbian Caribbeans and the incompatibility socially between those two. Michelle Cliff's Claiming an Identity They Taught Me to Despise, and if I could write this in fire, I would write this in fire. And Dion Brand's No Language is Neutral articulate that very clearly. More recently, the landmark anthology, Our Caribbean, a gathering of lesbian and gay writing from the Antilles, which Thomas Glave edited, also needs to affirm itself against hostility and silence. Glave says, it is in no way an exaggeration to say that this gathering originated as an idea born out of the most extreme longing. The desire to know finally and with complete certainty that a book such as this one actually existed and could exist in spite of thundering condemnation from Christian fundamentalist ministers and from those in churches, mosques and other places, sidelong disapproving and sometimes baleful glances, could exist despite prescriptions, banishments, ostracisms and in more than a few cases extreme violence. Could exist a book like this that, though some, including a number of our most renowned, if not always generous Caribbean minds, might wish to ignore or dismiss it, none would ultimately be able to deny or wish it away.